In this video, I'm going to show how you can create invoices with Stripe Connect to split a payment between a platform and a seller. This is a corporate training marketplace where sellers can put up classes that they want to sell on to companies. And I'm logged in as a customer at the moment. And if I click on the send inquiry button in a second, this is going to submit a query to the instructor who runs this class. We're now logged in as that instructor, and we can see that we've got this inquiry. And if we click on this confirm and send invoice button, we're going to do a couple of things that will result in us creating an invoice with Stripe Connect and then sending it on to the customer. You can see here the status has changed. We're now in that customer's email inbox, and we should see in a second that invoice is going to come through. And you can see it has qualified as the name of the platform that I'm using. And if we click on pay this invoice, we're going to be brought to this Stripe hosted page where we can fill out payment details. You'll see we have details of the lesson type there as well. Let me fill out these details really quickly. If the customer clicks pay, that payment is going to be processed through Stripe. It's going to be split between the platform and the seller, and we can download a receipt, which gives us further details. And if we go into our Stripe dashboard and look at payments, we'll see a payment for $219 just went through. And if we go to collective fees, we should see that 20% of that, which is about $59.80, went to the platform itself. Before we get into building out the workflows to generate invoices for our corporate training marketplace, I want to talk a bit about our database structure. We're going to be using 6 data types in total. We're going to be using the standard user data type with a few custom fields to define whether the user is a customer or a seller on the marketplace. And then we're going to be using 5 other data types that we're creating ourselves. This is just a suggestion. You can obviously set your database up however you like, but I do want to focus on these 4 custom data types specifically because they relate to the invoices. Whenever a customer generates an inquiry about booking a class, we're going to create a booking. And each booking is going to have an invoice. Each invoice is going to have at least one invoice item, and it can also have a transaction. I think it's useful to save down data relating to the transaction in your Bubble database. You don't have to do that, but I'm going to go through how exactly you would go about it. I'm going to put this image as a link in the description, so if you want to take a closer look at my database setup, you can look at that link. The next thing we need to do is we need to install the Stripe Connect Marketplace plugin. This is a Cranford Tech paid plugin, and you can install it by going to Add Plugins and searching for Stripe Connect Marketplace. Once you have it installed, you're going to need to add in a few API keys. When you scroll down to the bottom here, you'll see there's a bunch of fields we need to fill out. And the first one we're going to fill out is the Stripe Secret Key Dev. Now, I'm only going to be filling out the developer keys in this tutorial, but you need to do the exact same thing when you're deploying to live, but simply get your live Stripe keys rather than your test Stripe keys. So go over to your Stripe dashboard, and I have assumed for the purposes of this tutorial that you've set up a Stripe account and registered for Stripe Connect. Once you've done that, go to developers, go to API keys and reveal your secret key, which I'm now going to do. I'm going to copy that and I'm going to paste it in here. I'm also going to paste it into the API key dev field, but before I do, I'm going to type in the word bearer, a space, and then paste it in. And then finally the publishable key, as the name would suggest, is simply the publishable key from here. Copy that, paste it in, and you're good to go. Now, if we're creating a marketplace where merchants can sell services like a public speaking course and an advanced Excel skills course, then you will need to onboard them. You're going to need to allow them to create their own Stripe Express account and offer them the ability to list goods on your marketplace. I'm not going to go through that in this video just because I've covered it elsewhere and I really want to focus on the invoices. But again, I'll put a link in the description below to a video where I cover how to onboard merchants to your marketplace. For now, I want to focus on this class page. And this is simply a page that lists the relevant class that the merchant is offering. So in this case, we have a class in our database called public speaking. If I go to app data, go to classes, you'll see here one is called public speaking that has the cost, description, an image, and then it's also listed under the user who's offering that class. So in this case, it's going to be this user here, the new skills instructor 2 at gmail.com account. And What I want to focus on is what happens when a customer clicks on this send inquiry button. You can see here you can input some details like what date you'd like to put the class for, how many people are going to take the class. But I want to build out a workflow so that when I click this send inquiry button, we create something in our database that the instructor can then review. Once they've reviewed the booking inquiry, they can then send an invoice to the customer with confirmation that yes, we are happy to do it and please pay for this class. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to that class page, and on this button here, the send inquiry, I'm going to go to add workflow. And the first action I'm going to add is under data things, and I'm going to create a new thing. And the thing that I'm going to create is an invoice. You might remember invoice is one of the key custom data types that we've created. It's listed here. I'm going to add one field in for now, and that's the status field. So what we want to do is set the status of this invoice to make it clear that this has not yet been paid for by the customer. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to get an option, go to an option set, and I have a bunch of invoice status options here that I've created in my Bubble database. Awaiting response and then confirmed invoice sent. I'm going to take this awaiting response option and add it in here. So we're going to go for awaiting response and get its display. I'm then going to create a new booking. So I'm going to go to create a new thing, create a booking. And on the booking, there's a couple of fields that we can fill out here. The first one is the class, which is going to be equal to the current page's class. I've set the data type on the class page to be equal to class, as you can see here. I'm going to add in the customer. That's going to be the current user, so the person who's looking to make this booking. I'm going to add in the date, and this is the date that the user picks in the time picker here. It's the date that they'd like to have the class on. So I'm going to go to date time picker value. I'm going to go for invoice. So I just want to link this booking to a particular invoice, and we've just created this in step one. So I'm simply going to say result of step one, it's invoice. And then finally, the number of participants is going to be equal to input. I think 10 is what it's being called at the moment, but that's just essentially this input box here. And that's all we need to do for now. So I'm just going to then reset the relevant inputs. And I also have this alert element that I'm going to show. So show message in an alert box. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to my index page and I'm going to run as a customer. So I have 3 users created here in my database, 2 sellers and 1 customer. So let's just run as the customer. And let's go to that public speaking class that's for sale by one of our sellers. Let's book this for the 30th, and we'll just say 4 people want to take this class. So let's send that inquiry. Okay, we're getting our alert, our relevant inputs are reset. And if we go back to our database and look at all bookings, we'll see here we now have an entry. I just opened this up. You can see here we have the customer, we have the number of participants. We're linking it to a specific class and a specific invoice. And if I look at my invoice, we'll see here that we have status awaiting response, and that's it. Now I'm going to run as that instructor. So the instructor who offered that public speaking class was this one, New Skills Instructor 2. And they have an option to go to a dashboard. So this is a page that I built specifically just for instructors. And you can see I have a table here, and just take a closer look at that. If I go to dashboard, click on the table, the type of content is booking, and I'm simply searching for all bookings where the class is one of the current user's classes. So again, remember, back in our database structure, each user has a list of classes, and if the class in the booking is in the current user's classes, we're showing it here. And what we want to do now is, let's pretend we're in the instructor's shoes. We've got this inquiry, maybe we've got an email notification that someone's inquired. We basically want to say, yes, I'm happy to book this class, and send them an invoice. Maybe there's a bit of back and forth via email or some chat functionality you've added, but at this stage, the instructor is happy. They want to confirm that they're happy and send an invoice. So we're going to use this text here to create an invoice and send it. So I'm going to go to this, I'm going to go to add workflow. And I want to go back to my Miro board just because I have this built out in a bit more detail. What we're going to do is 4 steps essentially, and those are creating a Stripe customer ID for the customer if we don't already have one. But then we get into the meat of actually creating the invoice itself. And what we're doing is we're creating an invoice on Stripe, we're creating an invoice item on Stripe, attaching that invoice item to the invoice, and then sending it. So let's do steps 2 through 4, and then we'll come back to 1. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go click here to add an action. And because we've installed the Stripe Connect Marketplace plugin, we have a bunch of actions here that we have access to. And I'm going to go to create an invoice. And you can see here that we have a bunch of different fields we need to fill out. The first one is the Stripe customer ID of the person who's purchasing this class. And what we can do is we can go to current rows booking, customer, and their Stripe customer ID. For the seller, we can simply reference the seller account ID, which is going to be equal to the current user's seller account ID. Days until due. So this is a Stripe field, and it's the number of days after you generate the invoice as to when it's due. So I'm going to leave it as 30 for now, but you can change that. Platform fee is how much the marketplace is going to get. So we're splitting this payment between our corporate training marketplace, which we're running, and then also the instructor who's giving the class. I'm going to take 20% for our marketplace. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say current rows booking class and then its cost, and then I'm going to multiply that by 20, or 0.2 actually I should say, to get 20%. Now, one thing we need to be careful of here is you can see here we're defined a platform fee in cents, where in our database we defined all the classes in dollar terms. Stripe really prefers if you send values in cents. So what I'm going to do to convert this to cents is simply go to multiply by 100 to get it into cents. On behalf of, I'm going to leave this as no for now, but I'm going to come back to this because it's quite an important field. And then currency, I'm going to leave this as USD for now. Okay, so we've created an invoice, and next we're going to go to plugins, Stripe Connect, and we're creating an invoice item. So again, remember in our kind of 4-step process, step 2 is create the invoice. Then we're creating an invoice item to attach to that invoice. And if we go back, you'll see here it has a bunch of fields that are quite similar. And the first one is the customer ID. So again, we can go to current rows booking, customer ID. The invoice ID is going to be the ID of the invoice we've just created. And what we can do is simply go to result of step 1 and get its ID. Amount in cents is going to be the entire value of whatever class the customer is booking. So that's simply going to be current rows booking, class, cost. And again, we do need to multiply this by 100 just to get it in cents terms. Currency, it is important that you put the same currency in here as you would for the invoice. It will not work if you have EUR for euro in one and USD in another. So just be careful of that. And then finally, description is just going to be how this shows up on the invoice that the customer is going to get. I'm going to put in current rows bookings, class, and the class name itself. Okay, so we are now going to actually have to send this invoice. So again, going back to our kind of workflow action overview here, we've created the invoice, we've created the invoice item and attached it. And then we're going to send it using the Stripe Connect send invoice item. So I'm going to go back here, go to plugins, Stripe Connect, send invoice. This is a pretty simple one. We're simply sending the invoice and we're getting that by getting the invoice ID, result of step 1, its invoice ID. So nearly ready to go. You might see in my kind of workflow overview here, it is recommended as well that we save down the invoice details and the invoice item details to our database. You might remember back in our kind of database schema here, we have those 2 data types, invoice and invoice item. So before I actually send the invoice, I'm going to do that. I want to save these details down to my Bubble database. So let's go to, before we send the invoice, let's add in the relevant details. So I'm going to go to make changes to a thing because we're updating the invoice that we've actually already created. You might remember we created this invoice here, and we just want to fill out the rest of the details associated with it. So I'm going to go to current rows booking, its invoice, And what I'm changing is, first of all, the invoice ID, which as we saw is going to be accessed by getting the result of step 1. The invoice item IDs, which is a list field, and we're going to simply add in the result of step 2, its ID. So again, we're generating an ID when we create an invoice item and going to add that ID to our list. Status, we're actually going to change to get an option. Invoice status is equal to confirmed invoice sent, because again, remember, the instructor has confirmed they want to take this booking and they're going to send the invoice. And we're going to get display. And then finally, transaction, we're not going to add that in right now. We're going to leave that blank. So that's our invoice taken care of. We now just need to add this invoice item to our bubble database. So let's go to insert an action, and we're going to create a new thing for this one. It's going to be an invoice item. And we have 2 fields here that we can access. Amount in cents is going to be equal to current row's bookings class cost. And again, we're going to multiply it by 100 just to get that in cents. And then finally, invoice item ID is going to be the result of step 2, its ID. Again, this field probably isn't completely necessary, but I do like having an overview of everything that's gone on, so I do find it worthwhile to do these things. Okay, so now let's go back to our dashboard. And what we want to happen is when the user, who is the instructor in this case, clicks this, we're going to save all that data to our database. We're going to create the invoice, and then our user is going to get an email in their account here. So let's click that, and I'm pretty sure this isn't going to work, but it's going to be useful to show you how to debug. Okay, so we're getting this error, and the error doesn't really tell us much. It says create invoice error when parsing the response. The key error is not part of the B-type definition. That's not useful. And unfortunately, because this plugin uses server-side actions, we don't really get intelligent responses from Stripe when something occurs, but we can't figure out what's going wrong. And the way we do that is we go to our Stripe dashboard, we go to the developer sections, and then we click on logs. And you'll see under logs here, we're getting a 400 error with this most recent call that we've made to Stripe. And you can see here what's happening is this is all the data we sent through, but nothing's going through for customer. And we're getting that error detail there, no such customer, blank. So this error has occurred because we have not sent through the Stripe customer ID. And the reason we haven't sent through the Stripe customer ID in this field here is because we haven't actually created one yet. You can see here, and that hasn't populated either, but you can see here under users for our Stripe, for our customer, there's no Stripe customer ID associated with this customer. So what we need to do is we need to create a customer ID. And I will say that sometimes you may have saved in a customer ID for other reasons. So what I'm going to do is when we go back to that class page where we kind of kicked all this off, and when an inquiry is initially sent, what I'm going to do is if the user doesn't have a Stripe customer ID, I'm going to create one for them. So I'm going to go to insert an action. And again, I'm going to go to plugins, Stripe Connect, and I'm going to go to this time, create a customer, which is this action here. And the email is going to be equal to the current user's email. And then the name, you may have this saved down, you may not. I'm just going to put in Michael O'Shea for this example. Actually, no, I think I'm using that for the seller, so I'll just say John O'Shea. And I'm only going to run this action if the current user's customer ID is empty. I'm not going to create a new one every time if they already have one. I'm only going to do it if it's empty. But once we've created that, we can update the user type. So I'm going to go to make changes to the current user. And we're going to say customer ID is equal to the result of step 1, its ID. And again, we're only going to do that when the current user's Stripe customer ID is empty. So I'm going to delete the existing things that I have in my database just so it's obvious what's happening. So we have that invoice, we'll also delete. And let's run as our customer again. And we're going to book that class one more time. So go back to the home page, click on that public speaking class, And again, we'll put in a random date in the future. We'll say 8 people this time. Send inquiry. And you can see it took a bit longer that time, and that's because we were actually creating a Stripe customer ID. I want you to keep an eye on this column here, because if I refresh data, we should see a Stripe customer ID has now come through. And indeed, if we go back into Stripe and go to customers, what we should see now is that there's a new customer called John O'Shea. So let's then go back and run as our instructor. And I think it was this one here we wanted to run as. Let's go to their dashboard. And you can see, sure enough, they have a new inquiry about a public speaking class. Let's say they've looked at it, they're happy to give the class on that date, and they now want to confirm and send an invoice to the customer. If we now click on confirm and send invoice, we should hopefully see that go through. Okay, so the status changed from awaiting response to confirmed invoice sent. If we look at our database and look at bookings first of all, we can see here that's the latest booking. We have this invoice data entry, and we also have this invoice item data entry. If we go to our Stripe logs, we're going to see, if we refresh, hopefully another bunch of calls that were successful this time. Okay, great. You can see there we created a customer, we created an invoice, we created an invoice item, and then we sent it. And we don't have anything in this customer's inbox. And the reason for that is we're in test mode. You know, for demonstration purposes here, I'm not going to be using live data. And Stripe, maybe a bit annoyingly, doesn't send emails in test mode. So just know that if you were deploying this app to live and you were sending invoices in a live app, they would have been sent to the customer's email inbox at this stage. What we can do to simulate that behavior is, if you go back to Stripe, go to Invoices, and then this is the most recent invoice we've created. What you can do to kind of simulate that going to the inbox is just simply click on Send Invoice and then send it. And then when we go back to the user's inbox, we should see in a second that they're going to get that invoice come into it. And you can see there it is. So if I click on this email, this is what the user's getting from Stripe. And you can see there they owe $299 for that class. It's due in 30 days, which is the 5th of July. It's from Qualified. Now, just in case you're wondering, Qualified is the name of the platform that I'm using for demonstration purposes. The purple color around here is for its branding. And if we click on Pay this invoice, we now have the option to put in our card details, which I'm going to do very quickly. And now when I click Pay, that payment's going to go through. Give it a second. We can download the invoice, and we can download the receipt. Let's open up the invoice first of all, and you can see here it has that public speaking, which is the name of the class. And if we open up the receipt, we can take a look at that as well. And you can see there, that's the receipt, very similar information. You can change the look and feel of your invoices and receipts in the settings tab of your Stripe dashboard. So if you want to change the look, you can do that there. But what I do want to do is just show you how that payment's been processed on Stripe itself. If we go to payments and we look at all payments, we can see a $299 charge has just gone through. We get some details on it here. Because I'm using a Euro platform, it's converting it to Euro. But importantly, if we go to payments and we go to collected fees, we're going to see that we collected $59.80 for that particular class, which is 20% of the overall cost. And then if we go to our connect accounts, and it was this recent one that was selling that particular class, you can see here they received 215 euros of that total. So they received that, the rest went to our platform, the payment was successfully split. Before we move on to updating our bubble database with webhooks, what I want to briefly talk about is that on behalf of field that was important when we were creating the invoice. So again, if we go back to our dashboard page, look at the workflow associated with this text element here, you'll see that when we're creating the invoice, we can have this on behalf of set as no or set to yes. Now, we had it as no, and that means that the customer is transacting with the platform, which in this example is Qualified. If we set this to yes, that means the user is going to be transacting with the actual instructor, the merchant or seller on your platform. This is important if you want to represent either the platform or the seller, but it also has other implications, because if you leave this as no, but the platform and the seller on the platform are in different geographic areas, it will not work. So Qualified is an Irish platform, but if I run as the customer again, and let's say I book one of the other two classes. Now, I know, because I set this example up, that these other two classes, they are created by a user who has a Stripe account based in the US. So we're going to be US seller on an Irish platform. And let's just see what happens when we do that. Let's just say we're going to leave that as 5 people. Send the inquiry. You'll notice we didn't create a new customer there. And then let's run as that other seller. You can see here they have just got that inquiry. Going to go to confirm and send invoice, and we're going to get an error. And if we take a look at what's behind that error by going to get rid of all that, if we go back to the developer section of our Stripe dashboard and look at our logs, again, this is how you really debug errors. It does take a second sometimes to go through, so you may need to refresh it once or even twice. And I can see that's not going through. Let's take a look at the failed. And yeah, this is actually the error here. So if I click refresh on all, it should actually show up, and it was indeed there. But you can see here, I'm actually getting this error for a different reason. Okay, the application fee amount was not rounding to something. So let's change that. Let's go to that workflow, and then we're going to say platform fee. We're going to round this, and we're going to put in 0 there. Let's try that again. So we'll go to confirm and send invoice. Okay, I'm expecting a different kind of error this time. Useful to see what's causing the different errors. But again, if I go to developers and just give it a second and then I refresh, that's the same one. But if I go to failed, hopefully that one's loaded in. Not just yet. Okay, so this is the error I was talking about. You can see here it's saying we cannot create a destination charge for connected accounts in the US because funds will be settled on the platform and the connected account is outside the platform's region. So again, platform's region is Ireland, connected account in the US, Stripe will not let that happen. So if we change that on behalf of parameter to yes though, we should see that'll go through okay. So let's refresh. Let's try it again. You can see it's loading up, and that looks promising. We can see the status has changed. And if we go to our Gmail inbox, we're not going to get anything yet because, again, Stripe isn't going to send emails in test mode. But if I go to Invoices and look at the most recent invoice, I can see that that seems to have been created successfully. I can then click on Send Invoice. And we'll give this a second. Okay, so we've got a new invoice. And you can see this time it's not from Qualified. It's from Liam Jones, who is the other seller on the platform. And if we go to click on Pay This Invoice, you can see here there's no mention of Qualified. There's no mention of the platform whatsoever. That's because we've changed that on behalf parameter to yes. It's now the merchant or our seller, whatever you want to call them, that we're interacting with directly. Okay, I'm going to pay this invoice really quickly. And even though I'm paying this invoice and it's gone through successfully, we're not going to see our bubble database update. And this is the last kind of area I want to go through. If we go to our Stripe dashboard and go to payments, you'll see here that we've just gotten that $399 payment, which has gone through successfully. A fee has come off that, which you can see there, $79.80. But if we look at our bubble database, and if we look at the invoices and we look at the most recent one, you can see the status, and of the previous one actually, is still confirmed invoice sent. And that's what the instructor is seeing on their dashboard as well. So that's not really ideal because the payment has been made, but it's not been reflected in our bubble database. And in order to update our bubble database correctly, what we're going to do is we're going to use webhooks. And webhooks are essentially a way that Stripe can send messages to Bubble to let them know that certain actions have occurred, and then the Bubble database can be updated accordingly. The first step in getting webhooks set up is going to the settings tab of your Bubble editor, going to API, and then ensuring that this enable workflow API and backend workflows is ticked. You're going to need to be on a paid plan to do this, by the way. But once you do have that ticked, what you're going to see is that you have a new section here called backend workflows. And you can click here to add a backend workflow, new API workflow. And this is essentially the action that's going to update our database. I'm going to call this workflow invoice underscore paid. I'm going to expose it as a public API workflow, but I am going to require authentication, which I'll go through in a second. And we're not going to ignore privacy rules either. And then in order to connect this to Stripe, what we're going to do is we're going to change this parameter definition from manual to detect request data. I'm going to click on this detect data button and I'm getting this URL. And this is essentially the URL that's used to send messages from Stripe to Bubble. So I'm going to copy that. Then back in my Stripe dashboard, I'm going to go to developers. I'm going to go to webhooks. And I have a couple set up for some other test apps that I've created. It's probably going to look blank for you if you haven't done this before. But what I'm going to do is going to add an endpoint. And then I'm going to paste in that URL that I just copied a second ago. Now, this webhook is going to listen to certain events. And there's a whole bunch of events here that we can choose from. Some are related to subscriptions, you can see. But the ones we are concerned with relate to invoice. And the one in particular that we want to update or listen to is this invoice.paid event. So that when an invoice is paid, we do something. So I'm going to add that event. And then I'm going to add that endpoint. And you can see here, nothing's really coming through at the moment. It's waiting for events. And we need to initialize this webhook. There used to be really easy ways to initialize webhooks in Stripe. It seems to kind of disappeared or it's no longer readily accessible. So what you need to do instead is simply do this event, which in our case is create an invoice. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to my Bubble database and I'm going to have to cancel this for a second, but I'm going to run again as my customer. And I'm going to book the third class, which is the Advanced Excel Skills one. So again, we'll just put some any date in the future, say 6 people this time, send that inquiry, and then we're going to run as that instructor. Going to go to their dashboard. Going to go to confirm and send invoice. And then we're going to trigger that invoice to be sent to the email address in our Stripe dashboard. So again, go to that, send invoice, and then we'll see it come through here in a second. Okay, so let's pay that invoice. But before I put in my details and pay this, I need to open up that initialize URL that I had a second ago. So again, if I go to backend workflows, click on this, this needs to be open when you're initializing the webhook. So now I'm just going to quickly get rid of that one. I'm going to fill out these card details again. Okay, and now when I click pay, that invoice is going to be paid. Stripe is going to trigger that webhook, initialize it. And I should see now if I go back to my editor, that all this data is coming through, which is really useful. Most of this is fine. There are a couple of things that I recommend changing. Stripe passes dates through as numbers and Bubble interprets them as numbers, but what you actually want to do is change that to date Unix. We're not going to be using these data fields in this demonstration, but just for good practice, I recommend that. I think there's a couple of dates here that you probably want to change. That one. Yeah, that one as well. And this one as well. And then you click save. And what's nice about this is we now have access to all that data we just showed. And what we can do is we can go to make changes to a thing. We're going to do a search for an invoice. And we're going to look for the very first invoice, so the first item, where its invoice ID is equal to request data, which is all that data coming back in the webhook, and then its object ID. Not ID itself, because that's going to give you the event ID. You want the object ID. And then we can make some changes. We can say the status has been changed to request data, search for status. And we could update some other fields if we wanted, but I don't actually think we need to. But what we can do is we can create a transaction. You might remember when I was going through our database earlier, I said transaction was optional. I recommend having it if it's not too much extra effort, because it's just handy to have all those transactions saved in your database rather than looking at Stripe and trying to reconcile them. So what I'm going to do with my backend workflow here is I'm going to go to create a new thing. I'm going to create a transaction. The amount in cents is going to be equal to request data's amount paid. Customer is going to be equal to request data's, and in fact, it's not going to be request data's. What we're going to do is we're going to do a search for the users in our database, and then we're looking for the very first user. And again, we're going to use a constraint to find that first user, and it's going to be the user where their customer ID is equal to request data's objects customer. So again, we're getting the customer ID that's been sent back in the webhook. We're looking that up with all the customer IDs in our database and getting that user. Payment status is going to be the same as what we did for invoice. So maybe not necessary, but I just like having it separately. So objects status. Platform fee is going to be equal to request data's, and then I think it's actually called application fee amount in Stripe. So we're going to go with that. And then finally, the seller is going to be equal to request data's, and then I think the right field here is transfer data destination. We might have to double check that when it comes through in a second. And why is that not working? Request data's destination, evaluating as a text. Oh, of course, we'll need to do a search for it again. My apologies. So do a search for the user in your database where their seller account ID is equal to request data's transfer data destination. And then finally, I'm going to get the very first one for that. And then finally, we're just going to add this transaction to the invoice. So we're going to go to big changes to a thing. And then we're going to change the invoice. Transaction is simply going to be the result of step 2. Okay, so we're now ready to test this out, but we just need to do 2 small things to our webhook in Stripe. So let's go to developers, let's go to webhooks, and let's click on it, and let's go to update details. And what we're changing here is actually the endpoint URL itself. And the reason we're doing that is we have this initialize at the end of it, which is used to initialize it, but that's not actually necessary after we've done it for the first time. And in fact, you won't be able to run it if you have it there after the first initialization. So I'm going to delete that. And then I also want to add a bit of security to my webhook, because at the moment, if we don't add in authentication, then anyone can trigger this backend workflow, which is unlikely, and it may not even be that disastrous for your database. But for best practice, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the settings tab of my bubble editor. Under API, I'm going to generate a new API token. I'm simply going to call it API underscore token. I'm then going to copy this token by clicking on it, go back to my URL, and then get rid of that /, put in a question mark so that Stripe knows as a parameter, then put it underscore API token equals, and paste it in. So that's going to give that extra layer of security, update our endpoint, and we should have our webhook pretty ready to go now. So let's once again run as the customer and book another class. Run as. Let's go and book a strategy planning session again. Just one person this time. Then run as that initial instructor. Go to the dashboard. Should have another one here now. Awaiting response, confirm and send the invoice. And then let's get rid of that. But if we go to our Stripe dashboard, go to invoices, look at that most recent one. Send the invoice to our email. And I'm hoping this time that when we pay the invoice, that this status here is going to update. So Just for reference, what that actually is on the class page, on the dashboard page, it's the current rows booking invoices status. So again, we're updating the invoice, so hopefully we'll see that. If in our inbox, we see we have another one here. Let's pay this invoice. Fill out these details really quickly. Okay, so let's pay. And hopefully now we'll see this update in real time. And yeah, you can see there the status changed to pay. And if we go into Stripe and go to developers and webhooks, we'll hopefully see that went through. I'm seeing a 0% error rate, which is definitely good. And let's refresh that. Sometimes it just takes a second to actually show up. Yeah, and you see there we have the initialization and then it being paid. And if we go into our database, we should see that all that data relating to invoices has been filled out. And you can see their status has changed. We've added a transaction. And under transactions, you'll see everything is as it should be. Amount is correct, platform fee is correct. We have the customer, we have the seller, and we have the payment status as well. So that's how you update your database to reflect when an invoice has been paid. So I hope this has been useful. If you have any questions on any of this, you can let me know in the comment section below.